Linear switches. One of the most used types of switch that is preferred by many in the custom keyboard community. I personally don't like linear switches because there's no tactility and the sound profile is completely different from what I liked. In this video, I'll be using these linear switches for a week along with the linear gang here who's gonna be using clicky switches for the same amount of time. This is Amiro. He's a fellow custom keyboard YouTuber that has a completely different preference from what I like, so go check him out in the description below if you want to see his side of the challenge and what he thinks about clicky switches as a linear gang. So enough talking and let's get into the video. Clicky gang! So the only rules here is that we're allowed to use as many keyboards as we want, but it has to be the same switch type, which in my case is gonna be the linear switches, and at the end of the week we will give our conclusions of what we think about the switches that we initially hate. Since we're allowed to use as many keyboards as we want, I'll be using two different keyboards for the challenge. I'll be using my Keychron Q1 that has Akko Waves keycaps with Gateron Pro Milky yellow switches, as well as the vintage Dell AT101W with Alps SKCM Black switches. And for those who don't know a thing or two about Alps switches, is that Black Alps is actually a tactile switch, so I have to open every single of these switches and remove the tactile leaf, so that way, these are effectively the same as linear Alps SKCL green switches. And they sounded pretty unique compared from any linear switches I listened to. And I like this switch much more than the Gateron Pro Milky Yellows in terms of weighting, being at 70 grams, and the sound profile it gives is also pretty amazing. And if you're only stuck with Cherry MX style switches, I highly recommend trying out Alps style switches because in my opinion, they're much better than any Cherry MX style switches I tried. I already have an idea that I will use my Keychron Q1 as my gaming keyboard, especially that I already flashed it to have N key rolled over, as well as the polling rate is much higher now, being at 1000Hz compared to the standard 125Hz polling rate, whereas the Dell AT101W is gonna be used as a typing board. But for general use, I'll be using both of these keyboards from time to time, depending what I'm in the mood for. I'll be spring swapping 4 of the Gateron yellow switches to a later one I got from my Kale Super Speed bronze switches, which has a longer 20mm spring with a force of 40 grams, so I won't get tired as much when playing rhythm games like Eterna, while the rest is using stock switches. I didn't lube any of the switches because I don't think I need to, especially that it's already factory lube at the stems and it feels pretty smooth already. And my thoughts about these switches is that they're pretty nice. I like how smooth they are and the sound profile is pretty typical from what you listen to some mid-budget custom keyboards. The weighting is a little too light for my liking, as I personally like moderate to pre-tactile switches with 60 to 70 gram spring force, so there's a bit of a learning curve when using these linear switches that's only 50 grams of spring force, and it took me a couple of days to get used to it. Of course, before I get used to it in the first day, I got a lot of typos when using these switches, because there's no resistance from the lack of tactility and the lighter weighting doesn't help either. But it didn't hinder my experience as much. When I play rhythm games such as Eterna and Osomania, I kinda like how light the switches are after I spring swap 4 of them. I personally wouldn't use linear switches though in a certain skill sets, such as long jacks and vibros, but other than that, I would definitely use this switch for rhythm games, even though that the actuation distance is a little bit longer than what I personally like. On the second day of the challenge, that's when I got the idea of linearizing my Dell AT101W. It took me a few hours of linearizing my Black Alps switches, and the outcome is pretty surprising. I actually liked it more than the stock tactile ones. The weighting compensates the lack of resistance from the lack of tactility, as well as that they're pretty smooth without lubing and sounded pretty unique in a really good way. And for anyone who are curious how you linearize Alps switches, the process of opening up switches is completely different compared from the MX style switches. In MX style switches, you can just use the switch opener, but for Alps switches, you're gonna use 2 toothpicks, wedge it through the silts in both sides. Make sure you are not above the switch because sometimes the toothpick pops out from the silt and you don't want your eyes get poked by it. Grab some pliers and gently pull and wiggle the stem upwards. There, you can remove the tactile metal leaf, and since Alps switches uses a bump rather than a pole to hold the spring, you need a toothpick to guide the spring towards it, and make sure that the spring is standing. When putting back the top housing, I hold both the top housing and the stem together with tweezers and make sure to put above the springs while it's standing. Lightly press the spring, and if there are barely any resistance from it, you can press the top housing all the way down. Just in case that the stem feels a bit off, like you cannot press it down lightly or it feels weird when pressing, open the switch again and repeat the process until the stem feels pretty smooth and there's no resistance other than from the correctly seated springs when pressing. When you are done linearizing the switch, repeat the process until you've done it with all of the switches on the keyboard. The thing I like from Alps switches is that you don't need to desolder the whole switch because you can open them without desoldering them. Something that I don't need hot swap sockets anymore, and I'm completely fine with a soldered switch, and in addition to this, there's no risk of popping off the socket from the PCB. Day 3 and onwards was pretty straightforward. I became more and more comfortable now with both of my keyboards, and I'm starting to understand why people love linear switches so much. While I still like clicky switches much more than linear switches, even I used this for over a week, I can see where the linear gangs is coming from though. And when the challenge ends, we get into the call again with Amiro, and we chat about what we think about the switches we initially hate.
Okay, so it's been 1 week since we started, and how was your experience with the buttery smooth linears?
Actually, not gonna lie, it's much better than I thought it would be. I thought I'm
Yeah.
gonna hated it, but like yeah, like the Gateron yellows are pretty smooth.
Hmm.
It's a little light for my liking, but it's starting to grow on me in like in day 3 or 4.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get it. I really like those linears. Uh,
Yeah.
for me, day one was painful. Day two was painful. Day three was painful. Day four, day five, and day six were painful, and I hated every fucking second of it. I hated the clickies. What can I say? I hated the clickies. I can't type on them. I'm not gonna, and you'll see.
And that's it for the video. As always, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to my channel. Give us a feedback of what you think about this video, and if you don't like it, you can always give us a dislike as well, because even though YouTube hides the dislike counter, I will still see it through my dashboard, so honest feedback is much appreciated. And for anyone who is wondering what the keyboard sounds like, here's the sound test for both of my keyboards, and as always, thanks for watching!